The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has been working on an initiative called Engineering with Nature. It all started in 2010. And this is the EWN Podcast. EWN is developing and implementing nature-based solutions for water and infrastructure projects. It's bringing together a growing international community of scientists, engineers, and researchers from all kinds of disciplines that are committed to harnessing the power of nature to solve problems. The EWN Podcast tells their stories. Now here's your host, Sarah Thorne of Decision Partners.
How do we think about forests and their value? Well, we know that forests store carbon, and with climate change upon us, like many people, we might think the answer is just planting more trees. But hang on, our guests are going to challenge that conventional wisdom, and as the saying goes, they're going to help us see the forest through the trees. Welcome to Season 7, Episode 8. I'm here with Jeff King, lead of the Engineering with Nature program, and he's already laughing.
Thanks, Sarah. Yes, happy to be here today and really excited to be spending some time thinking about forests as systems. I think we're going to have a very, very interesting conversation today, and I'm looking forward to it.
Me too. I'm really happy to have Laurie Wayburn, who is co-founder and president of Pacific Forest Trust, join us for this conversation. Laurie has dedicated her career to forest conservation and sustainability. She is an innovator, a pioneer, and a really authoritative voice on forest practices and policy. Laurie, welcome. We're thrilled to have you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm delighted to be here.
And let me introduce Nathan Beane. Nathan is the leading research forester within the Department of Defense and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. He works at the Environmental Lab at ERDC, the Engineer Research Development Center in Vicksburg, but he spends a great deal of time in forests conducting research that supports both civil and military projects around the world. Welcome, Nathan.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm excited to be here. While I'm officially labeled a forester, I would more aptly be described as a forest ecologist. Foresters are known for cutting down trees, while forest ecologists study the environments where trees grow. In my day-to-day research, I'm certainly doing the latter. As lead of the Forest Ecosystem Dynamics team at ERDC, our research is primarily focused on forest communities, their function, health, management, and sustainment. As such, I'm thrilled to discuss the creation of resilient forests with Laurie, as I expect we share a lot of the same values on how to do so effectively.
I expect that you do. I think one of the things that we all share is a really deep passion for forests and the need to protect and preserve them. Jeff lives in a forest when he's not traveling, and I live by an old growth Carolinian forest, and I have a cottage deep in the woods of a northern Great Lakes forest. So we're surrounded by forests. But Jeff, for Nathan and for Laurie, their passion for forests goes way beyond that. It's really shaped their life's work.
That's right. I am so envious about their career path and where they actually work for a living. Very excited to hear more about what they're doing day to day. And it's true. Within the Engineering with Nature program, we do love our forests. And one thing we try to do on this podcast is to really dive deep, learn about what really drives our guests, what they're really passionate about. And so, Laurie, I'm looking forward to hearing more about your story and what led you to this passion for forests.
It was inescapable. I grew up in a family where our going to church was spending time in the magnificent old-growth redwood forests of Northern California and being deeply inspired and moved by that experience in a way that has lasted throughout my life. My family was very dedicated to both human health and planetary health. Both of my parents were involved in fields of that nature. And I went to work early on in the United Nations Environment Program overseas. So I worked in developing countries on the focus of how do you work with nature to provide for people's daily requirements, daily needs. And that really altered how I viewed people and nature. In America, you tend to grow up thinking there are people and there is nature. And in working closer to the earth, you realize, no, there is nature and there are people in it. And people can be a force for good and they can sustain it, or they can try to put it in a box that fits a certain financial model. And the time that I spent working in the UN really shaped what I do today, which is to focus on ways that we can provide financial incentives and a desired financial return by managing with nature and with forests in particular. So my focus on conservation is very active, and it is grounded in our learning how to manage forests as forests for all the things that we need.
Fantastic. Well, already, Laurie, you have given us a quote. There is nature and people in nature. And I love it. I absolutely love it. Boy, you have set the stage for us with this podcast. And so, Nathan, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your journey.
Sure. My love for the outdoors stemmed from my grandmother and the countless hours I spent outdoors with her, learning all I could growing up in South Arkansas. She lived through the Great Depression and taught me the value and skills necessary to know and understand the land. She knew the trees, the plants, and how to build the soil to make it do all the hard work for you. Time spent with her planted the seed, pun intended, to grow my love for trees and nature. As a result, I pursued a degree in forestry, and I recall during my first semester in college taking a course in dendrology, which is the study of trees, and knowing that I had found my place.
Nathan, I just love that. I love that your grandmother must taught you everything you know about forests from a young age, and she must have been a very, very wise woman. And I must say, she must have been pretty thrilled with the studies that you pursued.
Indeed, she was. She always enjoyed hearing about the things I was up to outside. So that passion led me to graduate school at West Virginia University, where I studied the impact of an invasive species on an ecologically unique old-growth forest for my master's work. For my PhD, I studied a high-elevation forest and a rare forest type that was at only 10% of its historic range and considered severely threatened by climate change.
And Nathan, I understand as part of that research, you spent a considerable amount of time camping. Tell us about that.
I spent 2 summers in a tent in the mountains to gather the data necessary to model the current distribution of this forest, which hosts many rare plants and animals as well as endemic species. That means that they only occur in this forest type and nowhere else in the world. Additionally, as part of that research, I was able to map where reforestation efforts should be implemented to restore this rare ecosystem, providing connectivity for these isolated forest communities, as well as considering future climate change scenarios. I was able to provide guidance on where to restore trees that made the most sense ecologically by mapping suitable habitats, and climatically by identifying where the climate was most likely to be supportive for these forests in the future. The goal of my research was to provide guidance on where reforestation efforts should be prioritized that were most likely to succeed. This research effort helped me land my job at ERDC, and I haven't stopped studying trees, forest ecosystems, and how to manage them effectively.
Yeah, well, Nathan, that's quite a story, and I certainly am familiar with your work, and boy, does ERDC benefit by having you on staff. And I think about all of the issues and challenges that we face, thinking about climate change and how important it is for us to have these forests and to have them be sustainable. And your path clearly offers a trajectory that will allow ERDC to continue to lead in this space, and with your expertise, help us to manage and protect these forests for years to come.
Absolutely. I want to pick up and talk about something that Laurie said when we were doing our planning meeting. Laurie, you said that you wanted to speak for the forests. I'd like you to talk about the forests as systems and help us really understand what that means.
Yeah, well, when people use the term forestry, what they're typically thinking about is the production of timber commodities or fiber commodities. And that phrase, seeing the forest for the trees, is all too apt because so many people think of forests just as a collection of trees. but they're infinitely more than trees only, although they are very diverse in their trees as well. Forest systems begin well below the ground and end well above the top of the canopy. And the trees are the most visible piece of an extraordinary storehouse of biodiversity that comprise the forest overall. From the tiny microorganisms in the soil to the upper canopy layer, entire world exists up in the upper canopy. Forests function to clean our air, to collect, store, and transport our water, to be the home of many of our pollinators, to being the locus of our streams and rivers and lakes. And they function all together. Forests don't just function as trees alone. Whether you're thinking about how fungi meld their little tiniest roots with those of trees so that you might even think they were a single organism. Or you're thinking about how many animals make their homes in trees, whether they're Pacific fishers denning in large trees, or whether they're pileated woodpeckers, or whether they are bluebirds. It is such an amazing world. And we have managed forests for single purpose outcomes, greatly simplifying them. And what that does is break down the system overall. So in my work, what I have focused on is understanding how the system overall works, and then looking at how we can derive our products from that integrated function, as opposed to trying to squeeze that integrated function into a single outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that you were talking about when we spoke previously was that this system was under stress before, but that stress has been exacerbated by climate change.
Absolutely. If you think about it, humans and forests have interacted for a long time, but in the decades since the Second World War in particular, we have so perfected our mechanisms for harvesting trees, and we have so grown our population that we have vastly diminished the amount of forest that exists, and we have fragmented it. That alone is a tremendous impact on how forests can function. In addition, we move all around the planet now. And that means we take pests and diseases from one part of the planet where they evolved and are adapted to that system, and we've moved them to all kinds of other systems. And if you will, it's a little bit like when Europeans came to the so-called New World and brought all the Old World diseases. Mm-hmm. The people who lived here did not have any immunity to those diseases. And as a result, you had massive, massive infections. And that is true in forests as well, when we have so many invasive pests and diseases that have come in and impacted them. So even before climate change really was expressing itself in these extreme heat waves or extreme precipitation events or droughts or unexpected polar vortices, we had these systems under significant stress. As Nathan was pointing out earlier, we'd greatly reduced the extent of various forest types to the point where they are threatened or actually have become extinct and lost, other than as germplasm. So what happens is a bit like a human being. If you're super healthy, you can take a certain amount of stress. Have a good night's sleep, have a good meal, go out with friends, you feel better. But if that stress doesn't let up and you just keep adding more to it, you have a very difficult time functioning. And that is the impact of climate change on top of an already fragmented and degraded suite of forest systems around the world.
I'm sure that makes a lot of sense to you, Nathan, that we need to think about forests, the whole body, the whole system, when we think about the complexity of forests.
Yeah, it sure does. Laurie, I enjoyed hearing you talk about the integrated function of forest and the importance of diversity, because forests are so complex and incredible. By improving our understanding of forests and how they function, I think we can do better science to inform management, including planting trees. And while trees are oftentimes the poster child of a forest ecosystems, I feel like they sometimes steal the thunder, minimizing the complexity that forests offer, especially in a world with exacerbated effects of climate change, as you mentioned. Forests are so critical to understand. While they provide key habitats for a range of wildlife, including the threatened and endangered species that you mentioned, they also generate oxygen, filter water, and provide soil stabilization, which is a big part of what our job is. Forests also provide many services outside of typical views of tree-derived products. As you mentioned, Laurie, a lot of the focus is on saw timber and pulpwood production. But forests play an important role in carbon sequestration, ecosystem biodiversity, natural disaster mitigation, and also provide flood control. I don't think of watershed management without picturing a forest, and I doubt many of the listeners do either. So I'd like to commend you, Laurie, and your efforts as part of the Pacific Forest Trust to highlight the importance of advancing forest conservation and stewardship practices. This starts with people, as we've mentioned, and I think Laurie's efforts are critical. While I'm in the weeds studying these ecosystems across the country, her work is so important to encourage and enable landowners to implement these efforts following sound science.
That's so true. And Laurie, I really appreciate how you were able to explain that to our listeners, and this idea of how complex these forest systems are, and then also thinking about it from the standpoint of our own health and well-being, and that if we're healthy, we can take a little bit more stress. But in this example of climate change and all of these other variables, it's just really creating an environment where our forests are in jeopardy. And we really need to take a step back and think more about a systems level kind of intervention and what can we be doing to ensure the health and productivity of our forest systems. And so, Laurie, thinking about your role and you being there at the forefront of these conversations on forest, can you tell us a little bit about what is central to your message? What do you want our audience to come away with when we think about forest?
Jeff, one of the most critical things I hope we can help people think about is forests are essential infrastructure. And just as we think about roads as essential infrastructure, or the internet as essential infrastructure that we couldn't possibly live without, well, actually, we probably could, but we could not live without the essential infrastructure of forests. And that is because, as Nathan says, this is where our oxygen comes from. This is where our clean water comes from. This is where so much of our food comes from. And yet we take them for granted, completely for granted. We do understand that we pay taxes to maintain our roads. We might want our roads in better shape, but we totally accept that public dollars will be spent to maintain our roads.
That's right.
The same is true for so much of our essential infrastructure. And with forests, we simply expect that they will be there and we will have them for timber, or we will have the land to develop for other purposes. And somehow magically, forests will still continue to do everything that we rely on them for. So one of the most important things is to recognize that that infrastructure exists because there's something we call a public-private partnership behind it. There are public benefits out of forests, and there are private benefits out of forests. The private benefits out of forests are understood to be timber and other commodities, or the fact that you can sell the land for it to become a development. The public benefits are the water, the climate stabilization, the clean air, the biodiversity, the absolute awe. When Nathan was saying about how important forests are for soil, I was saying, and for soul, because we know that forest bathing is extraordinarily important. Our cortisol levels drop way down, and our immune factors come way up when we are in forests. So it's critical for us to recognize that we need the same public-private partnerships to sustain the forests that sustain us as we do this other infrastructure that we accept. Now, a big difference is that we tend to accept infrastructure that we build. So if we build a dam, we say that's infrastructure. But if we are blessed with forests, we take it for granted. the pivot point we need to be in our lives, and I think that this is something that I've been thrilled that the Army Corps has done, is recognize that given that we are a part of nature, we need to work with nature as that essential infrastructure. That also means we need to help pay for it. Money may grow on trees, but trees don't only grow on money. And forests certainly need the kind of investment that we are recognizing we need to do in other sectors of climate mitigation. And that is a real shift that I hope to see in my lifetime.
That's great, Laurie. I have to tell you, we and our listeners, we believe in forest bathing. We understand the value of forests from a human health perspective. We've talked about that on a number of our shows.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
We also understand that forests are a critical part of natural infrastructure. Jeff, maybe you can talk about that a bit.
Well, I think that Laurie has hit on so many really important points here. And we did have Florence Williams on, the author of The Nature Fix, to tell us about the importance of nature bathing. And it's wonderful to hear Laurie also echo that sentiment as well. And this idea of forest as infrastructure and how we need to think differently about it, and the importance of the public-private partnerships. And this really did resonate for me from the standpoint of all of the important elements that the public has a right to, and how we need to be thinking about that long term. And this sort of takes me back to the Executive Order 14072, which was really focused from this administration on the importance of nature and this national nature assessment, and thinking about how important our forests are to this overall inventory of what I would say are critical assets that we need to be mindful of and to be managing and preserving for future generations.
Absolutely. Nathan, talk a little bit about your perspective on forests as natural infrastructure.
Sure. I love hearing Laurie talk about her love for forest. It's we're kindred spirits, and I'm a big fan of that idea, and really highlighting the importance of forests that we have today and how we manage them effectively. There's so much low-hanging fruit there that we can learn from on how we can inform how we perform afforestation, which is planting in areas that were previously not forest, and then reforestation, where we're planting trees in areas that were once forested. There's a lot of keynotes here for building and sustaining natural infrastructure by incorporating both of these forest management opportunities. And so there's an importance to understanding the role that forests play in the areas they exist. And that's what Laurie's highlighted today. There's just so many factors there that are just critical that really just aren't on a lot of folks' radar, in my opinion. And not all forests, especially related to tree species, are created equal. So there's a need to understand those forests, the functions they provide, and how we can integrate that into building things that incorporate elements of natural infrastructure. And regarding reforestation, there's so much importance in understanding the planting of the right tree in the right place at the right time.
We're going to talk a little bit more about reforestation as one tool, but Laurie, I'd like to talk now about Pacific Forest Trust and how you started it, what you're working on, and why it's especially important now, the work you're doing.
Well, we started the Pacific Forest Trust. I'm the co-founder. The other founder is a woman named Connie Best. But we started the Pacific Forest Trust 32 years ago with a focus on conserving and working with private forest landowners. Now, why did we do that when most people think about the public lands in the U.S. as forests, and they don't really think that much about private forests? Many people actually go, gosh, we still cut trees? And we do. But not only that, the majority of our forests are actually privately owned, and the most productive of those forests are privately owned, and the forests that we are losing are privately owned. We have a tremendous issue that is kind of a hidden crisis. Roughly the size of Delaware disappears every year in forest land conversion into other uses in the U.S. And very few people wake up in the morning and have their cereal and go, oh gosh, another 6,000 acres went, boom. It's a very hidden phenomenon. But when those forests go, for all the reasons that we've talked about earlier, we lose a host of other values and services from forests. So we founded the Pacific Forest Trust with two things in mind. One was to understand why we weren't keeping our forests when everybody knows they're so important, and then address the why. And the why is very simple. It's in the financial best interest of landowners to either convert or to harvest as much timber as possible, because the more you cut, the more you earn. The quicker the turn, the higher the earn. So what we wanted to do was actually work with what I would call the enlightened self-interest of private landowners, and to make it financially competitive or even more desirable to keep your forests as forests and to manage them as forests, not just as plantations, but to manage them as forests with that full suite of functions. So we went about identifying where were there means by which we already could pay forest landowners for redirecting or setting a new trajectory for their forests to be more naturally managed, to be older, to have the suite of biodiversity that we all depend upon, and to be able to rely on that for forever. Because as Jeff pointed out, this isn't just a conversation about us or our kids or even our grandkids. It is about the unending span of time. A very difficult concept for people to wrap their brains around. What does forever mean? Amazingly enough, there is a tool in the United States legal toolbox that actually does just that. It's called a conservation easement. And it is a voluntary agreement between a landowner and a qualified entity, a qualified land trust, or in some cases a governmental agency, that says they are dedicating their land forever to be managed for that natural forest function, inclusive of but not limited to timber and fiber products. So it's a fantastic tool that pays landowners dollar for the opportunity cost of keeping their land as well-managed forests. And that's an extraordinary tool. But it was never being used for this purpose until we began the Pacific Forest Trust. So we developed a new application of that tool to focus on managed forests. Historically, you used conservation easements either to just stop subdivision or to never touch it because, again, people thought of people as the enemy of nature as opposed to being part of nature. So in order to protect it, you had to keep people out and not manage it. And we said, people can do a lot more than that. We can learn enough and guide ourselves with the understanding of how these forests function to set a performance goal of what we want to manage for in the future. We want to manage for a relatively natural forest. Let's document that. And then assess ourselves against that over time to ensure we're getting there. So that was our first financial incentive, and it's a very significant one because it'll pay a landowner roughly half the total value of their forest to keep managing it as a more natural forest. So they'll keep getting timber revenue. They'll keep getting chip and biomass, but they will also be paid for the opportunity cost of foregoing the liquidation of the forest, of foregoing the conversion of the forest. So that's really powerful. Then we turn to one of the other services. Actually, we've identified two other services that are ones which people really know they need. One, of course, is climate. So as an organization, we worked with the California legislature to get the first law passed ever that recognized the value of standing forests for climate, not just of tree planting, but standing forests. So avoiding deforestation and growing older forests. Older forests store far more carbon, far more resiliently than young crowded plantations. And so we were able to get that law enacted as part of the climate policy for the state, and that has led to some very significant investments and the use of forest carbon offsets as a compliance tool under the state's regulation. Then the third really critical area is, of course, what Nathan was pointing out about watersheds.
Mm-hmm.
Forest watersheds are the unsung heroes of water provision, and particularly in the West, where we don't, the West of the United States, where we don't have unfiltered water the same way much of the country does. Water gets, pumped for hundreds and hundreds of miles, so people don't have much association with where their water comes from. But without those watersheds, your dams, pipes, and canals cannot function effectively. So they're the yin and the yang. So we developed a law that was put into effect in California that recognized legally watersheds as part of water system infrastructure and enabled their financing to be done the same way, the repair and maintenance, so the conservation and restoration of watersheds. And we're still working on the next phase implementation of that, but it's a rather landmark law to have the role of watersheds as infrastructure legally recognized and have the framework for a payment system established.
I tell you, Laurie, Boyd, you have a blueprint for success. I mean, seriously, those three areas where you've led and created change are just really, really important for us to better understand, for our listeners to comprehend. And I'm hopeful, Sarah, we can include some links associated with this podcast to be able to highlight many of these success stories that Laurie's sharing with us.
In the second part of our podcast, we're talking about the climate change imperative. We pick up by asking Laurie to talk about the climate crisis and her work in California.
So every crisis is also an opportunity. It doesn't feel like it when you're in the crisis, for goodness sake. It just feels awful. Well, the climate crisis is that. It's a crisis. But it also creates the opportunity for people to think differently. And one of the things that actually was just announced yesterday that I'm very proud to have worked on is that the state of California has just announced a first in the world, very ambitious target for working with natural and working lands to help solve the climate crisis. Absolutely pioneering, and it's something that a committee which I have led was principal in developing, and targeting that for the state of California to meet its climate goals by 2045, it really has to embrace a different approach to how we manage land, how we manage and conserve land. And this is critical because once you've placed that target out there as a priority in the policy realm, then you can align the funding sources behind it. And California, amongst other states, has put a price on greenhouse gas emissions. What do you do with that money? Well, up until recently, primarily that money went to green transportation, to green energy. Now we can direct some of that money, a significant portion of it, into green infrastructure, whether it's from the cities and cooling our cities. One of the things Nathan and I didn't really talk about, but it's absolutely true that greening our cities vastly improves the quality of life, particularly in your frontline communities. Human health, ability to learn, lowers crime rates. You can just walk through all the benefits of a greener city, and much cooler in the summer, warmer in the winter. This, if there's any, if you will, critical message for communities and for people across the country, it's to embed nature in climate solutions. And the benefits are so multifaceted. Water regulation, so diminishment of floods, temperature regulation, diminishment heat waves, local climate, attraction and retention of water. All of these things that are so impactful with climate change are And they're also linked so integrally with human health. That's one of the most interesting things. But from the point of view of how can we generate the scale of money that is absolutely essential, it is through this crisis. And the other really fabulous thing is it's a heck of a lot cheaper than any of the other solutions, and it's much more immediate. If you change what you're doing with the forest today, you see the benefit that year, the next year, and on into perpetuity. I drive an electric car. I know perfectly well that I've got 5 years to pay off my carbon debt before I'm doing better. So we need to do everything we need to do. This is not that nature alone will solve this, but we have not had it front and center. And as a result, we've disinvested. Now we can put it front and center because it is such an effective, immediate, scaled climate solution.
Yeah, that's great.
So it's really, really exciting. Nathan, jump in and talk a little bit about the work that you're doing, particularly the work you're doing for the Department of Defense, and how they're looking at this whole climate change imperative and the role of forests and wetlands management, green infrastructure management. Talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Thanks, Laurie. It's so great to hear all the work that you're doing. There's so many corollaries to the research I do every day to try to drive the importance and relevance of the things that you're discussing. So my work is quite different. I'm doing a lot of on-the-ground research, supporting the Corps and the DoD, which simply means I travel a lot and look at trees and what's wrong with them and how we improve them and produce management recommendations for installation managers and also the Corps projects. I go to where challenges exist. So I get many opportunities to travel and look at whatever problems they may be. And then I do research to try to discover and develop solutions to address those issues. And this involves working on military installations and Corps projects across the nation and coast to coast and even sometimes abroad.
I think it would be helpful, Nathan, if you put some of the forest science that you're doing in perspective for us, particularly the amount of land that the Army Corps has. I don't think Laurie was talking about, which was surprising to me to hear, the amount of private land that is forested. I think people would be surprised to hear how much land you're managing through the Army Corps of Engineers and the opportunity there.
I think a lot of our listeners are aware of military installations across the country. They're big. They have names associated with them and sometimes even challenges that, make the news. But they're probably far less likely to be familiar with the Corps' presence in the U.S. So the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, so you'll hear me say USACE, they have over 400 lake and river projects across the nation. And that's over 42,000 miles of shoreline that those water bodies encompass. And that land base is over 12 million acres. And so the projects that the Corps has, they offer safe public access with a host of outdoor recreation activities to the level that there are more than 260 million visitors each year at these Corps projects. Mm-hmm. Additionally, the Corps serves as stewards of their lands and the waters at each of these projects. So as a result, conservation management and resiliency are sewn into their national resource management framework so that they can ensure a balance of those environmental things that we're discussing today, as well as those recreation needs for the visitors.
Well, Nathan, clearly you have your work cut out for you. That's quite a lot of land and resources that require a lot of attention and a lot of support. And so maybe you could talk about some of that specific R&D that you're leading and offer our audience more information about what you're working on.
Sure, I'd be happy to. There's many research efforts we're leading in support of the DoD, and we currently have a range of incredible projects, and these span from doing dendrochronology investigations, which means tree ring research, that allow us to do these forensic level research efforts to look into the past, as well as evaluate and document the uniqueness of rare forest and wetland communities. And if that's not cool enough, we're working on some things that have global application and at a global scale, where our forest ecosystem dynamics team is characterizing the terrestrial surface of the earth. We're going to be able to describe vegetation characteristics to inform military planners. But in the context of today's conversation, there's one effort I'm really excited about, and that's sharing some of the work that we're doing to support the U.S. Marine Corps and how we're incorporating resilience on military installations in the face of climate change that really highlight that green infrastructure that we're talking about today.
So Nathan, you're doing a whole lot of work on a whole bunch of different things across the United States and actually beyond. I want you to talk a little bit about the really significant work that you're doing with the Marine Corps. Tell us a bit about that.
Sure. So we launched a pilot study last year at Townsend Bombing Range in Georgia. The goal of this project was to quantify carbon in trees in both the above ground and below ground biomass, as well as look at the soils in both wetlands and forested habitats across that installation. So a vast majority of the carbon research that's been done is done using remote sensing, and there's not a lot of ground validation incorporated into those efforts. And so to fill that need and that data gap, what our team does is go out and collect that data on the ground to be able to validate estimates and also provide more realistic numbers for carbon storage and sequestration opportunities. And so in addition, what we try to do is also look at reforestation opportunities, as we talked about today, putting the right trees at the right place at the right time. And to do so, we use a tool called the Reforestation Hub that is a product of the Nature Conservancy. It's a great tool. It prioritizes lands that they express in acres of opportunity across the U.S. to restore forest cover for climate mitigation, and it's a great tool to quickly calculate where there are opportunities for reforestation work. However, what this tool doesn't do is look at military mission requirements. That includes land use and management necessary for training. And so what our team will do is go in and down select and remove those areas from estimates that we have on those installations. And what we can do with that information is then quantify a more accurate reforestation opportunity to provide realistic ratios that highlight the success of ongoing work that's happening in most of these places, including a lot of work at Townsend Bombing Range. And that allows us to get real acreage estimates to look at that opportunity that's in the denominator.
Our conversation moves on to talking about the role of fires in forest systems, starting with those on Department of Defense military bases.
You know, the DoD bases are actually refuges for biodiversity across the U.S. And some of the work that's been done actually in the Southeast with the military, I think is particularly interesting, which is, recognizing the role of fire in these systems. As Nathan said early on, all forests are very, very different. But one of the big lessons there and in other DoD installations is, again, focused on forests as systems and as dynamic systems. And that has to do with the role of fire. Fundamentally, every single forest type in the United States is fire adapted. Canada too, actually. But we became so effective at managing fire, we selectively managed for mega fires. The only fires that get out are the really, really big ones. So we kind of did the opposite of what indigenous people understood, which was manage for low intensity fire. And DoD has had some really excellent controlled burning work. As I say, particularly in the Southeast. It's something that I think the rest of the country is beginning to wake up to, and it's an incredibly important piece of having a resilient, dynamic, big carbon store in forests. Actually, these low-intensity fires, the natural regime of fires, is so important to maintaining the productivity of our forests, and by managing for that kind of fire, you really avoid, to a highly significant degree, really diminish the risk of megafires, these catastrophic high-intensity fires. So while DoD might not have intended that to be the outcome, they've been a really impressive player in that field, and I think are highly supportive of that. So some of the research that Nathan is referring to is actually being very, very helpful.
Laurie, I'd like to touch on the comment you made about the importance of fire and how military installations, even if it might have been accidental at first, have found the value of repeated fire. Those lower intensity fires that you mentioned are so important for ecosystems. I'll also highlight some of an example using Tyndall Air Force Base, where other climate forcings have caused some concern for understanding the green infrastructure that's in place. So in the 1940s, due to commercial forestry and naval storage demand, much of the native longleaf pine forest that you mentioned were harvested, and that resulted in extensive conversion to commercial slash pine and sand pine. However, following Hurricane Michael in 2018, which was the strongest hurricane to make landfall in the continental U.S. since Hurricane Andrew in 1992, much of that installation was destroyed to the level of billions of dollars of damage. What they learned from that catastrophic event was that the types of trees mattered, that the native longleaf pine would have provided added resilience to this unfortunate event. And as a result, efforts today on Tyndall Air Force Base are strongly focused on restoring that longleaf pine ecosystem and the fire regimes that allow that system to persist.
Thinking about the work that's happening at the military installations and the investments that have been made by Department of Defense in this idea of creating more resilience through use of natural infrastructures. And certainly forests are a big part of that overall composition in terms of a multiple lines of defense strategy. And Nathan, maybe you could talk a little bit more specifically now about what you have been doing to support Department of Navy and some of those Marine Corps installations.
Sure, absolutely. Working with Deb Loomis and Jackie Rice in support of the Marine Corps, which is a component of the Navy, for those that were not tracking, our Forest Ecosystem Dynamics team, we're working all over the place looking at those carbon storage and sequestration opportunities that were started at Townsend Bombing Range last year. This year, we're going to be looking at over 170,000 acres to support the Marine Corps. That includes the largest Marine Corps base on the East Coast, which is Camp Lejeune, and the high elevation forest, which is over 6,800 feet at the Mountain Warfare Training Center in California. And at each of these bases, we're evaluating and identifying opportunities to incorporate the EWN elements and applications that we've talked about today wherever we can.
And I would say there, Nathan, that I too have been working closely with Department of Navy over the last several years. And Miss Deb Loomis, who is the climate advisor to the Secretary of Navy, she has really, really leaned into this and has been a strong advocate for incorporation of nature-based solutions into the entirety of the resilience plans for these military installations. And she was an architect of the Navy's Climate Action Plan 2030, which also highlighted the need for Department of Navy to integrate nature-based solutions into their resilience strategies, as well as this idea of thinking more and acting more when it comes to carbon sequestration and how can the Navy do that better. So excited about what Ms. Loomis is doing, and certainly a big fan of all the work that they've done, and very grateful to the Navy for the collaborations with the EWN program.
That's great, Jeff. And we're really hoping that we can get Deb Loomis and one of her colleagues on the podcast really soon to talk about that work.
That's right.
And thanks, Nathan. It's, really important work that you folks are doing with the Navy. Before we wrap up, we want to hear what's ahead for both of you. Laurie, what's going on for you? What are you going to be working on to the end of the year and beyond?
Pacific Forest Trust is what I like to call a think and do organization. So we were once characterized as, you are that tree cutting, tree hugging, bridge building organization, to which I said, you bet. So we own forest land, we manage forest land on other people's behalf, and then we manage our conservation easements. And this year we have a couple of super exciting projects that we are doing. One is protecting 10% of the Upper Trinity River. And some of your listeners may be familiar with the Central Valley Project, a huge water engineering project in California, which provides primarily agricultural water, but also some drinking water to California, which is such an agricultural financial engine in California and California for the U.S. and the world. So 10% of that is a conservation project we're hoping to complete before the end of the year. And another really cool project is that we are doing the largest implementation of prescribed burning on private commercial forest land. Really trying to demonstrate what Nathan and I have been talking about, which is how do you get fire back on the landscape safely when you've excluded it for so long?
Interesting.
And we're doing several controlled burns on lands that we manage and are working with Native American practitioners as part of that as well. And we're also involved in what we hope will be an historic land back project for some tribes in California, the Southern Sierra and Miwok tribe. So that's on the kind of direct land management and conservation side. And then we are also working, as we do in the policy realm. Our goals in policy are to make it easier to do good things. And so we're working on several pieces of legislation that to expand the scale of prescribed burning, making it easier to do both for the regulatory agencies and for the landowners. And then we're also laying the groundwork to really help implement what we started talking about in the beginning of the program, which is building the public capital to partner with private landowners as well as public landowners to manage and conserve their forests in an active way for climate. So that is about generating financial resources, both from our greenhouse gas reduction funds and from a climate bond that we're putting up. And then some really fun projects about restoring beavers in Oregon. Because beavers, as you guys know, are nature's apex engineer.
That's
They
exactly
put
right.
us to shame with what they do in terms of water storage. So we are big, as they call them, beaver believers. And in the states in which we work on the ground, we are working actively with many partners to get beavers back hard at work.
Wow. Well,
We don't want unemployed beavers.
well, it sounds like to me that could be a great T-shirt. Maybe you could print a couple of those out and make those available to people. I would certainly pick one up.
All right.
It sounds like very, very ambitious goals,
Indeed.
and certainly lots on your plate, Laurie. But boy, you sure are accomplishing a lot. So
Planning and doing.
press on, and good luck with the beavers.
Thank you.
Nathan, tell us what's ahead for you this year and beyond.
Sure. We talked a lot today about reforestation and the importance of forests. And I just would like to highlight that we recently launched a reforestation survey working with the headquarters USACE to evaluate the challenges, the efforts that are in place, and future opportunities across every core project in the nation that has environmental stewardship as one of their mission responsibilities. And this is over 350 of those 400 projects I mentioned earlier. We received a greater than 95% response rate that highlights the interest in this space. And this is going to come with a lot of data that we're going to use to help move us forward in locations across the nation to do and implement the things that we've discussed today. And then I'll just lastly mention supporting the DoD. We're working across the board, but at those Marine Corps locations, like I referenced today, we're going to 3 of those sites this year, and next year we have 5 more installations on the agenda. And so we're excited about the road ahead and the ways that we can incorporate the elements, including these EWN applications that we've discussed.
Well, Nathan, you've got your work cut out for you, but they've got the right guy doing the job. I know that this is going to keep you busy for quite some time, and certainly excited to be part of that, to be able to have you there at ERDC in the environmental lab leading this effort, and to be able to keep us updated from time to time. And, you know, thinking about this, and we've talked a little bit about all these opportunities ahead, but as we're coming to the end here, and before we let you go, we'd like to ask you one thing that you would like us and our listeners to be thinking about. And Laurie, we'd start with you.
One thing I would love your listeners to think about is, to paraphrase Star Wars, may you be with the forest, and may the forest be with you. And that as you go about your daily life, whether you live in a forested environment or not, it is to be aware of and grateful of, shall we say, the grace and blessing of forests, and to return the favor. They don't exist without people caring and being involved. So the most critical thing is that every single person can make a huge difference in ensuring that those forests are there for us if we are there for them.
Very good. Very nice. And Nathan, what are your thoughts? What would you like to leave us with?
Sure. Yeah, I don't have a catchy phrase, but I do have a bumper sticker in my office that says trees are the answer. And I'm a big advocate for that, but I think it's important today just to highlight that it's critical that we understand the complexity of forest, that it's more than just those trees and the monoculture systems that are often implemented today. And having an understanding of those forest ecosystems at a broad scale are really important, particularly in a post-wildfire landscape. We have a lot of challenges ahead of us, and I think it's just really important that we continue to conduct research in this space, and I'm really glad to be a part of the EWN program that supports this.
Well, Nathan, right back at you. We're glad to have you part of the EWN team and family as well.
Laurie and Nathan, you've really, really given us a lot to think about, thinking about forests as critical systems that, to your point, Laurie, we all have a role in valuing the forest, protecting the forest, preserving the forest. And, I hope you feel like you've achieved your goal through this podcast in helping us see the forests through the trees. You certainly have for Jeff and I.
Right.
So thank you for your insight. Thank you for sharing your passion for forests with us and for sharing the critical work that you're both doing to help protect the forests that we have and to make them more resilient to the challenges that we all face. Thanks for being on the podcast, Laurie.
Thank you so much for having me.
Been delightful. And Nathan, thank you for coming and telling us about the work that you've been doing.
I loved it. Thanks, Laurie, for taking the time today to share all you're up to. This has been a good conversation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and
Let's do it again.
Indeed. Yes. And so Nathan, Laurie, thank you so much for spending time with us today and helping us to think more about the system and the importance of these forests. And you've given us a lot to think about.
Thanks, Jeff. And to all of you, thank you so much for listening. We hope that you've enjoyed this podcast, and we hope you'll join us again when we talk about engineering with nature.
You've been listening to the EWN podcast, developed by Sarah Thorne and Jeff King, National Lead, Engineering with Nature Initiative, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Now, for more information, you can visit our website, engineeringwithnature.org. The EWN podcast is produced by Eye Contact Productions for the Engineering with Nature program within the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I'm Dave Trafford.